highlands on Skye or any of the other islands in Scotland. The nearest one is that one we pointed out in Kyle on the mainland just before we went over the bridge. It leads back to Inverness. It's a very scenic trip. There's one further south called the Portree. After the Harry Potter movie, it goes over the viaduct. Further south, it ends up in Malay, and then you can take a ferry to Skye or to Armadale from Malay. That's another very scenic route we journey. It's one of the best. So we're basically following the eastern coastline of Skye, making our way up and round Portree. Names that were most popular on Skye were mainly the MacDonalds first and foremost, and the MacLeods, who had a lot of Viking heritage and DNA in their bloodlines. That's why a lot of the place names in Skye and other parts around the Highlands are actually Nordic Viking names. So there's a mix of Celtic names and a mix of Nordic names. This little township, Scullabus, that's a Viking name, that's not a Celtic name. So we had MacDonalds living on Skye, MacLeods, also Nicholsons, who were based mainly up in Portree, up around near the capital. Smaller number of clans as well. Nowadays, of course, the clan system doesn't exist like it used to. We still have clan leaders, we just There are two whisky distilleries on Skye. One we passed the side of, it's the way down that road on the left. Torraveg, it's a pretty new distillery. Just been in operation for the last 5 or 6 years. And the more well-known established one, Talisker, which is away across on the west coast side of the island. It's been in operation since the late 1800s. Whisky, of course, is a big export earner for Britain, not just Scotland. Originally, the Irish were making whisky before the Scots, really, as far as they know. But Scotland now makes a lot more volume of it with a lot more distilleries. Shock horror, even 1 or 2 places in England have had the temerity to make whisky in England. Educated down there, they no longer even speak with a Highland accent. They might have the title of clan chief of the MacDonalds, but to hear them speak, they speak like Prince William. It's because they're privately educated in England, mostly. Not exclusively, but mostly. So this little town village we're going through is the second largest one on Skye. It's called Broadford. Originally it would have been a little fishing settlement and a little area for farmers to get together for markets and things like that. Obviously tourism is the main industry now. You see lots of little niche shops and gin distilleries and things like that. It used to be in the west coast of Scotland, the consumption of alcohol, not just whisky but malted whisky, was huge. there were a lot of big issues with alcoholism, partly because of the really bad weather throughout the year, you know, lots of rain, sometimes see sunshine for weeks on end, especially. Well, it's changed a bit now. The reliance on drinking is not so strong, but it's still there a little bit. So my wife is English, from the south coast of Devon. Before I met her, she ran the hotel here in the 1980s, this one here on the left, this white hotel. And she was very new to the area, didn't know anything about the Wild West, which was known as Skye and other islands, because it was a different land then from the rest of Britain, had a different set of rules of social living. But because she didn't try to tell the locals what to do with themselves, she got on very well. But if you're one of these people who try to tell locals over here what to do, they would just ignore you completely. Make it fair, they used to have a rotation every couple of years where people would move around, so no one got the poorest land all the time or the best land. That was known as a run rig system. Probably the most popular musical band in more recent years in the Highlands was the band called Run Rig, named after that agricultural system of rotating the land for people to farm. It's no longer used today. People have their own bit of croft land or farmland and they'll just keep it, do with what will. Insect that lives in the Highlands that is infamous for being a real nuisance to people. It's called the Highland midge. It's like a tiny mosquito. The only good thing is it doesn't carry any diseases like bigger mosquitoes. There's no malaria or any other bad diseases, but they're incredibly aggravating because even though they're tiny, they can land on your skin and take a little bit of your blood by giving a little bite. There's so many of them, even though they're tiny, they're infuriating. And you get different varieties of them, and the worst varieties tend to be on Skye and some other west coast areas. They're attracted by the humidity of the landscape. They like to live in boggy areas where there's lots of watery ground. They tend to come out when there's not much wind. If it's really windy, they tend to stay in the ground. When it gets very calm, they come out in huge amounts. Good news is that generally they're more numerous from June onwards right through to October. But there will be some beginning to appear this month already, but not so many. They don't like direct sunlight. It tends to burn them up. If the sky is overcast, it's fine. Skye is generally a volcanic island. It's been influenced by relatively recent volcanic activity. By that I mean 60 million Cambrian era that are more than 1.5 billion years old in some of the oldest surface rocks around. One of the reasons why Skye does not have white sand beaches is because of the volcanic rock. It tends to be a lot darker and more stony. Scotland is a pretty tidy country, but it has more variety of geology than any other country on earth. Because of that, back in the Victorian era, Aberdeen University built the biggest geology department in the whole world. And that was so that scientists could come up to the north of Scotland and go all over the highlands studying all the different rock forms. Just over 100 years ago, a couple of those geologists were up in the far northwest of Scotland, just a bit north of here, and they were looking at land formations and wondering why what they were seeing was different. From that, they worked out about the fact that all our land continents drifted around for eons of time. Just like India is still pushing the Himalayas higher, as it's pushing up the rest of Asia. The Cambrian era that are more than 1.5 billion years old in some of the oldest surface rocks around. One of the reasons why Skye does not have white sand beaches is because of the volcanic rock. It tends to be a lot darker and more stony. Scotland is a pretty tidy country, but it has more variety of geology than any other country on earth. Because of that, back in the Victorian era, Aberdeen University built the biggest geology department in the whole world. And that was so that scientists could come up to the north of Scotland and go all over the highlands studying all the different rock forms. Just over 100 years ago, a couple of those geologists were up in the far northwest of Scotland, just a bit north of here, and they were looking at land formations and wondering why what they were seeing was different. From that, they worked out about the fact that all our land continents drifted around for eons of time. Just like India is still pushing the Himalayas higher, as it's pushing up the rest of Asia. Summit of Everest, as it used to be under the ocean. So there's no real live volcanic activity in Britain anymore. We get a very occasional minor so-called earthquake, but it's such a low scale it's not really an issue. We don't get those big, well, you occasionally feel them, but they're not big enough to be very destructive. Yeah, you do get them, but they're very low strength. It's not like the ring of the Pacific or Italy. Salmon fish farm down there. You can see the little dark grey circular rings where they have the cages for the fish, and you'll see lots and lots of them all dotted around the whole coastline around the Scottish Highlands. You can see through the clouds some mountains dotted around the other roadside. These mountains are known as the Red Cooling Mountains. There's two sets of mountains in Skye, the red and the black Cooling. had a big tradition of early mountaineering. To see it in the mist, but there is another island over on the right called Raasay, spelled R-A-A-S-A-Y. R-A-A-S-A-Y. It's called Raasay. It's where, you might know it's where they filmed Who Dares Wins. You know, the SAS program? Well, it's not, but that's where Who Dares Wins is filmed. You know, with the media people through their faces. It has a whiskey distillery now over on that island, and it's served by a ferry that runs across, a proper commercial ferry that runs from the island. Yeah, that's right, yeah. Its population has been going up recently because it's had more development. Along with the distillery, the whiskey and the gin. A friend of mine, John Hayes, built that key. Private, you can just go across the Raasay provided you book your ticket for the ferry. As regular crossings separately, depending on the weather. So you'll notice there's quite a lot of sheep on the island. Been sheep here since the time of the clearances that I mentioned. Notice that they either have colour markings on their back or sometimes a number, and the reason for that is in the highlands and islands a lot of the sheep don't just stick to one field, they're quite often wandering along the roadside or just generally moving around. So in order to identify the individual farmer's sheep, it's why they number them or put a colour code on them so they can identify whose sheep belongs to who. Originally the sheep were brought up all those years ago because the value of wool was so high and Britain was industrialising, but nowadays the wool is almost worthless and it costs more to shear the sheep and get rid of its fleece than it does selling the wool. So it's only really for the meat that they keep the sheep. And when the sheep are having their young lambs, they try to have twins every time because that's the ideal number. Area known as Slagakin, which was the site of a well-known Victorian era pub, restaurant, hotel. And that's where those old-fashioned mountaineers from the Victorian era, you know, from the mid-1800s up to about 1910, were visiting Skye, staying in the hotel and going climbing up the mountains just round the corner here. There's a whole Skye ridge, a very rocky ridge of 11 Munro summits. There's actually about 15 different peaks, but 11 of them are 3,000 feet summits. Now it's a very popular mountaineering challenge that people take on. Sometimes have to book accommodation a year ahead of schedule to get in. So when we get into Portree and get parked up, there's a set of steps up behind the coach car park. I'm going to be at the top of that, folks, so I can point you in the right direction for the public toilets, and obviously you can use, if you go into a cafe or a restaurant or anything, you can use their facilities as well. And just point you roughly in the right direction to where the shops and the cafes and everything are. If you do want something like looking out to sea, they have some takeaway fish and chip shops there. Straight along. We're just entering Portree now. building on the left is where they do a lot of cultural things to keep the traditions of the Celtic language, the Gaelic language alive. And they'll have music festivals and they show documentaries and movies in there as well. And they're generally just trying to keep the traditions, the old ancient Celtic traditions alive, because the Gaelic language very nearly died out about 100 years ago. It was made illegal for many years after the Jacobite Wars to speak Gaelic, on pain of death for a while. Of course, blacksmiths everywhere on earth.
That's what you like.
Blacksmiths everywhere on earth. As we go along on the left here, we're going to see the big senior school that I was talking about. Just carry on straight ahead.
It's 20 miles an hour.
It goes down and round to the right. Just bring that way. Yeah, just for that way. Just go right.
Oh, okay, no.
Straight through. Just follow it down to the left. Coach park is away along at the far end.